Hidden beyond the southern edge of Riyadh, Al-Hire prison has become one of the most closely guarded detention complexes in the Middle East. Built to hold individuals accused or convicted of serious security-related offenses, the facility operates largely beyond public view. This documentary examines what is known, based on court records, government statements, and reporting by international and regional news organizations, about Al-Hire's purpose, operations, and the cases that made it infamous. Where details are disputed or unclear, they are marked accordingly. If you want more real, fact-based true crime documentaries like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It was supposed to be invisible. On paper, it barely existed. No tourist signs, no public tours, no official photographs released with any regularity. Even satellite images tell only part of the story, a grid of walls and roads fading into desert haze. Yet for years, a single name has circulated quietly through court filings, human rights reports, and late-night conversations among lawyers and families searching for answers. Al-Hire. According to public records and news reports, the prison sits south of Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, a country known for its sweeping deserts, oil wealth, and a legal system that blends codified statutes with interpretations of Islamic law. Al-Hire is not a typical penitentiary. It is a high-security detention center, administered under the authority of the Saudi Ministry of Interior, designed to hold people the state classifies as threats to national security. Here's the contradiction that pulls you in. This was meant to be the most controlled environment in the kingdom, purpose-built to prevent chaos, escape, and uncertainty. And yet, for years, it has generated more unanswered questions than almost any other facility in the country. Some call it a prison. Others call it a detention center. Former detainees, speaking anonymously in verified interviews, have called it something else entirely. A place where time stretches, names dissolve, and the outside world becomes a rumor. Before we go any further, understand this clearly. This story is built from publicly available sources, court filings, government statements, and investigative reporting. Where facts are disputed, they are labeled as such. Where names are unclear or legally sensitive, composite identities are used and marked accordingly. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Now listen carefully. In 2019, international news outlets reported that dozens of detainees were transferred to Al-Hire following a wave of high-profile arrests. Some were clerics. Some were activists. Some were accused militants. The charges varied, but the destination did not. Families were often informed late, or not at all. Lawyers complained of limited access, according to verified legal correspondence cited by rights organizations. The government insisted the detentions were lawful, necessary, and tied to security concerns. And then came the whispers. A chilling quote attributed to a former detainee began circulating in foreign media, carefully paraphrased to avoid retaliation. "You don't know if you are forgotten or if you are being prepared." That line alone was enough to draw attention. But it wasn't the quote that made Al-Hire infamous. It was the silence around it. Most prisons announce themselves through statistics, capacity, security levels, rehabilitation programs. Al-Hire announced itself through absence. There were no press briefings explaining daily operations. No official visitor logs released publicly. Even the exact number of detainees inside has varied across reports, depending on the year and the political climate. According to reporting by multiple international outlets between 2017 and 2022, Al-Hire became a central holding facility for individuals accused under counterterrorism laws and cybercrime statutes. The laws themselves are public. Their application, critics argue, has been opaque. The government disputes those claims, stating that all detentions follow legal procedure and judicial oversight. Two narratives. One facility. And a widening gap between them. To understand how Al-Hire became what it is today, you have to step back, not just years but decades. Saudi Arabia's modern security infrastructure expanded significantly after a series of violent attacks in the early 2000s. Publicly acknowledged terrorist incidents prompted sweeping reforms, including new detention facilities designed to isolate and monitor high-risk suspects. Al-Hire, according to government sources, was part of that effort, a specialized center with layers of surveillance, reinforced perimeters, and strict internal controls. The official purpose was prevention. The unofficial consequence, according to critics, was secrecy. One former legal advisor, quoted anonymously in a European newspaper, described Al-Hire as a legal black box. He did not allege illegality. He alleged invisibility. That distinction matters. Because under Saudi law, detention for security offenses can involve specialized courts and procedures. Trials may be closed. Evidence may be classified. Sentences may be severe. All of that is legal within the system. But legality does not always equal transparency, especially to an outside world accustomed to open courtrooms and public records. This is where the story tightens. In late 2018, following a globally reported diplomatic crisis, scrutiny of Saudi detention practices intensified. Journalists began mapping facilities mentioned in court cases. Al-Hayr appeared again and again, sometimes as a pretrial holding site, sometimes as a long-term detention center, sometimes only as a footnote, transferred to Al-Hayr. No photos, no descriptions, just the name. Families searching for loved ones described a bureaucratic maze. According to interviews published by human rights organizations, some were told to wait. Others were redirected between agencies. A few eventually received confirmation, months later, that their relatives were being held at Al-Hayr. One woman, identified here under a composite name as Amina, told a foreign broadcaster that she learned of her brother's location through a lawyer who had heard it unofficially. Her brother, she said, had been arrested on allegations related to online speech. The government has not publicly confirmed or denied the specifics of her account. Her brother's case remains unverified in detail, and is presented here as reported. What is verified is this: Al-Hayr became shorthand for something final. Once someone was sent there, their case moved out of public view. Even among Saudi citizens, the prison's reputation is muted but heavy. It is not discussed openly. It is referenced indirectly. According to regional journalists, mentioning Al-Hayr in conversation is often followed by silence. The physical layout, as inferred from satellite imagery and construction contracts reported in trade publications, suggests a compound built for containment. Multiple perimeter walls, guard towers, controlled access roads, interior zones likely separated by security classification. None of this is unusual for a high-security prison. What is unusual is how little has been officially described. This vacuum invites speculation. And speculation, when left unchecked, hardens into myth. Some reports claim prolonged solitary confinement. Others allege harsh interrogation tactics. The Saudi government has denied abuse allegations and maintains that detainees' rights are respected. International observers say independent verification is difficult due to restricted access. So what do we do with a story like this? We do what responsible true crime storytelling demands. We separate what is known from what is alleged. We mark uncertainty clearly. We follow the paper trail, not the rumor mill. And the paper trail begins with the laws. Saudi counterterrorism statutes, updated and expanded over the last 2 decades, allow for broad definitions of security-related offenses. Court filings reviewed by international legal analysts show cases involving alleged militant activity, financing, recruitment, and, in some instances, nonviolent political expression deemed destabilizing by authorities. Al-Hayr appears repeatedly as the detention site for defendants awaiting trial or serving sentences. The facility is not unique in that role, but it is the most frequently cited. Former officials interviewed by journalists suggest logistical centralization. High-risk detainees are easier to manage in one place. Specialized staff, controlled information flow, tight security. From a state perspective, it makes sense. From a transparency perspective, it raises alarms. And that tension, between security and scrutiny, is the heartbeat of this story. Now here's the moment most viewers don't expect. Despite its reputation, Al-Hayr is not entirely sealed off from the legal system. Detainees have appeared in court. Verdicts have been issued. Sentences have been recorded. Appeals have been filed. This is not a secret prison in the sense of total disappearance. It is something more complex. A prison that exists fully within the law, and yet, for much of the world, outside understanding. And that's why this matters. Because the true crime here isn't just about individual cases. It's about how modern states manage fear, control information, and define security in an era where visibility itself can be a threat. Before we continue, take a second to support this channel. If you value fact-based, deeply researched true crime documentaries that go beyond headlines, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. This story only gets deeper from here. We'll step inside the system itself, how detainees are processed, what publicly known cases reveal about life inside Al-Hayr, and where the official record ends and the unanswered questions begin. Because once you pass those gates, the rules change, and the silence gets louder. The first thing that disappears is certainty. According to court filings and verified reporting, detainees sent to Al-Hire prison often arrive without the markers that usually define the beginning of incarceration. No public arrest record released at the time of transfer. No booking photo. No confirmation of how long they will remain. For families and lawyers, the process does not begin with a courtroom. It begins with waiting. In Saudi Arabia's security-related cases, arrests are frequently carried out by specialized units under the authority of the Ministry of Interior. This is documented in official government statements and acknowledged in public trials. What happens next, however, depends entirely on classification. If a case is deemed a national security matter, the procedural path changes. According to publicly available legal frameworks, detainees may be held during investigation periods that are longer than those in ordinary criminal cases. The justification, according to the state, is the complexity of security threats and the need to prevent interference with ongoing investigations. Critics argue that this flexibility opens the door to prolonged detention without clear timelines. Al-Hire sits at the center of that tension. Multiple court records reviewed by international observers show defendants stating that they were held at Al-Hire for months, or in some cases years, before their first formal court appearance. The government has responded in past statements that judicial oversight exists through specialized courts and that detention durations comply with Saudi law. Both statements can be true at the same time. The law allows it. The experience can still feel endless. One verified court transcript from the late 2010s, cited by legal analysts, includes a defendant stating that he lost track of how many days he had been detained before being formally charged. The judge acknowledged the detention period but ruled it lawful under counterterrorism statutes. No abuse was alleged in the transcript. What was alleged was disorientation. That detail matters because Al-Hire is not described by former detainees as a place of chaos. It is described as a place of order taken to its extreme. Former prisoners who later spoke to journalists under conditions of anonymity described a rigid intake process. Clothing replaced with standard issue garments. Personal items cataloged and removed. Communication restricted. Movement controlled down to minutes. These descriptions appear across multiple interviews conducted years apart, suggesting consistency, though independent verification remains limited. One former detainee, identified here as a composite individual named Khalid, told a European broadcaster that the intake process felt less like entering a prison and more like being erased and rewritten. His account is unverified in specific detail but aligns with other testimonies regarding strict administrative control. He described being escorted through corridors without windows. He described fluorescent lighting that never changed. He described being instructed not to speak unless spoken to. The Saudi government has not publicly commented on individual accounts but has consistently denied allegations of mistreatment, stating that detention facilities operate under regulations designed to ensure safety and dignity. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, not because of what is alleged but because of what cannot be independently confirmed. Al-Hire does not allow routine access to foreign journalists. International monitoring organizations have reported difficulty obtaining entry. Domestic reporting is limited by law and custom. As a result, much of what we know comes indirectly, from court documents, legal correspondence, and interviews conducted after release. Those releases, however, tell a pattern. Detainees held at Al-Hire often describe isolation, not necessarily solitary confinement in the strictest sense, but isolation from the outside world. Phone calls, when allowed, are monitored. Visits, when approved, are infrequent and controlled. Lawyers may require special authorization to meet clients, according to correspondence cited by human rights groups. Again, the government disputes claims of obstruction, stating that legal access is provided in accordance with regulations. Inside the facility, according to consistent testimonies, daily life follows a precise rhythm. Wake-up times fixed. Meals standardized. Movement scheduled. Surveillance constant. This is not unusual for a high-security prison. What makes Al-Hire distinct, according to analysts, is the category of detainees it holds. These are not exclusively individuals convicted of violent crimes. Court filings show that some detainees were accused of financing extremist activity, others of planning attacks, but others still were charged with offenses related to speech, association, or online activity under cybercrime or counterterrorism laws. The legal definitions are broad, and their application has been the subject of international debate. One publicly documented case involved a cleric sentenced after being detained at Al-Hire. His trial was conducted in a specialized court. The verdict was announced. The sentence was severe. The legal process existed, but the months leading up to it were largely invisible. This leads to a critical point. Al-Hire is not a prison designed to break people through disorder. It is designed to control people through structure. Former detainees describe an environment where unpredictability is removed, but uncertainty remains. You may know when you will eat. You may know when you will sleep. You do not know when you will leave. Psychologists who have studied detention environments note that this kind of uncertainty can be deeply destabilizing. While these analyses are general and not specific to Al-Hire, they provide context for why former detainees often describe the experience as mentally exhausting rather than physically violent. There are allegations, reported by international organizations, of harsh treatment during interrogations. These allegations are disputed by Saudi authorities and cannot be independently verified in many cases. Where courts have addressed such claims, rulings have varied, with judges often finding no evidence of abuse. Critics argue that standards of proof make such findings difficult. What remains uncontested is this: interrogation is central to Al-Hire's function. Detainees are not sent there simply to be held. They are sent there to be processed through an investigative system designed to extract information, assess risk, and determine long-term outcomes. That system operates largely behind closed doors. According to legal experts, once a detainee is classified as a security suspect, information gathered during detention can shape everything that follows: the charges filed, the court they face, the sentence imposed. This is where the stories begin to diverge. Some former detainees report being released without charges after extended detention. Others report being transferred to different facilities after sentencing. Some remain incarcerated to this day. The criteria behind these outcomes are not publicly detailed. One unconfirmed report published by a regional outlet suggested that internal review boards periodically reassess detainees' threat levels. The Saudi government has not publicly confirmed the existence or structure of such boards. The report remains unverified. But court outcomes suggest some form of review does occur. In several documented cases, defendants held at Al-Hire were eventually acquitted or given sentences shorter than their pretrial detention period. This suggests that detention does not always correlate with guilt as determined by the courts. It does, however, correlate with suspicion. And suspicion in a security context carries weight. For families, the experience is often described as a prolonged suspension of normal life. According to interviews published by credible organizations, relatives may receive limited updates. Some are told not to speak publicly. Others fear consequences if they do. This silence feeds the prison's reputation. Al-Hire becomes not just a place but a warning. In domestic discourse, it is rarely mentioned directly. In international discourse, it is often cited without detail. Both approaches reinforce its mystique. Yet within Saudi Arabia's legal framework, Al-Hire is not officially exceptional. It is one facility among several used for security detention. What makes it stand out is scale, frequency of mention in court records, and the high-profile nature of many detainees sent there. This raises a difficult question, one that cannot be answered definitively with available information. Is Al-Hire a symbol of a system under strain, or a system working exactly as intended? Government statements suggest the latter. Human rights critiques suggest the former. The truth, as with many institutions operating in secrecy, may lie somewhere in between. What we can say with confidence is this: once someone enters Al-Hire, the narrative of their case changes. Time slows. Visibility drops. Control tightens. And that is not an accident. We will examine specific publicly documented cases tied to Al-Hire, what the court records show, what the verdicts reveal, and how individual stories illuminate the broader machinery at work. Because behind every legal classification, there is a human story. And some of those stories refuse to stay buried. If Al-Hire were only a building, it would remain an abstraction. Concrete, steel, fences in the desert. What gives it weight, what pulls it into the global spotlight, are the cases that pass through it. Names that appear briefly in court records. Charges summarized in a few lines of legal text. Verdicts announced without context. And then silence again. But when you line those cases up side by side, a pattern emerges. According to publicly available court documents, international news investigations, and verified reporting, Al-Hire prison has held individuals from multiple, distinct categories. Not one type of suspect. Not one kind of crime. But a spectrum that reveals how Saudi Arabia defines risk, and how broadly that definition can stretch. The first category is the one most often cited by officials. Individuals accused of violent extremism. Court filings confirm that Al-Hayr has housed suspects charged with planning attacks, financing militant networks, recruiting fighters, or maintaining contact with designated extremist organizations. In these cases, the government's position is clear and publicly stated. These detentions are necessary to prevent violence and protect civilians. Some of these cases are well documented. In several trials reported by regional newspapers, defendants described being interrogated for extended periods before formal charges were issued. Judges acknowledged the detention timelines and ruled them lawful under counterterrorism statutes. Sentences ranged from long-term imprisonment to, in the most severe cases, capital punishment following conviction. Appeals were recorded. Legal procedures were followed as defined by Saudi law. These cases, while controversial internationally, fit within a framework familiar to many countries facing militant threats. It is the second category that complicates the story. Nonviolent security cases. According to court records reviewed by international legal observers, Al-Hayr has also held individuals accused of offenses related to speech, association, or digital activity. Charges cited include disrupting public order, inciting unrest, or communicating with hostile entities through online platforms. The laws underpinning these charges are public. Their interpretation is broad. One verified case involved an academic detained and later tried in a specialized court. News reports confirmed his detention at Al-Hayr prior to trial. The prosecution argued that his public statements constituted a threat to national stability. The defense argued they were protected expression. The court sided with the prosecution. The sentence was issued. No allegation of physical abuse was formally upheld in court. Legally complete. Publicly documented. Deeply contested. Another case, reported by multiple international outlets, involved an online commentator arrested after posting content critical of government policy. According to his family, he was transferred to Al-Hayr shortly after arrest. Court documents later confirmed his detention and eventual sentencing. The government stated the case involved national security violations, not mere criticism. The distinction remains disputed in public discourse. These cases are why Al-Hayr attracts attention far beyond Saudi Arabia's borders. Because they challenge a basic assumption many viewers bring into this story, that high-security prisons are reserved only for the most violent offenders. At Al-Hayr, the line is not violence. It is perceived threat. The third category is the least discussed but perhaps the most revealing. Individuals never formally charged. According to reports by international human rights organizations, some detainees held at Al-Hayr were eventually released without public charges or trials. The government has not provided detailed explanations for these outcomes, though officials have stated that detention during investigation does not imply guilt. Court systems around the world operate on that principle. But when detention stretches into months or years, the distinction becomes blurred. One former detainee, speaking anonymously to a foreign broadcaster, described being released after nearly 2 years. No charges. No verdict. No explanation beyond a brief notice that he was free to go. His account is unverified in detail, but similar stories appear across multiple reports. Legal analysts suggest these outcomes indicate internal review mechanisms, processes that assess risk and determine whether continued detention is justified. The structure of those mechanisms is not publicly disclosed. What is clear is this: Al-Hayr is not just a place where sentences are served. It is a place where decisions are made. And those decisions shape lives long after release. Former detainees who later spoke publicly described lingering consequences: travel restrictions, employment difficulties, social stigma. Even without a conviction, time spent at Al-Hayr leaves a mark. In one verified interview, a released detainee stated that potential employers quietly withdrew job offers after learning where he had been held. No explanation was given. The implication was enough. This is the quiet power of a name. Al-Hayr does not need publicity to exert influence. Its reputation travels ahead of it. International reactions to these cases have been mixed. Some governments have raised concerns through diplomatic channels. Others have remained silent, citing sovereignty and security cooperation. Public statements, when made, are often carefully worded. Behind the scenes, according to investigative reporting, discussions about detainees at Al-Hayr have appeared in diplomatic cables and private negotiations. These documents, where released, show tension between security partnerships and human rights advocacy. The Saudi government has consistently responded by emphasizing legality, judicial oversight, and the threat posed by extremism. Officials argue that external critics lack full context and underestimate the security challenges the country faces. That argument resonates with some audiences. It fails with others. And that divide is why Al-Hire has become more than a prison. It has become a symbol. For supporters of the system, it represents control in a dangerous world. For critics, it represents the cost of that control. But symbols can obscure reality. Because inside Al-Hire, daily life continues in routines that look on the surface like any high-security facility. Meals, prayer times, supervised movement, surveillance. According to former detainees, violence between prisoners is rare. Disorder is not tolerated. Everything is regulated. This order, however, does not erase fear. Fear does not always come from chaos. Sometimes it comes from precision. One former detainee described knowing exactly when the lights would turn on, and never knowing when his case would move forward. That imbalance, he said, was harder than uncertainty in every direction. His statement cannot be independently verified, but it echoes across accounts, and it points to something essential. Al-Hire is not designed to shock. It is designed to endure. Cases move slowly. Attention fades. Headlines shift elsewhere. Meanwhile, files remain open or quietly close without public explanation. This is how institutions maintain power without spectacle. What happens when Al-Hire intersects with the outside world? When international pressure, media scrutiny, or diplomatic stakes force its existence into the light? Because sometimes the most secretive places reveal themselves not through leaks, but through conflict. And when that happens, the consequences reach far beyond prison walls. Secrecy works best when no one pushes back. 4 years, Al-Hire prison existed in a controlled quiet, known but rarely challenged in public. That changed when individual cases began to collide with international politics, media pressure, and diplomatic consequences. This is the moment when a closed system is forced to look outward. According to verified news reports, global attention on Saudi detention practices intensified after a series of high-profile political events in the late 2010s. Foreign governments, journalists, and international organizations began asking specific questions. Not about laws in general, but about locations. Where are these detainees being held? Under what conditions? For how long? Again and again, the same answer surfaced in court filings and legal correspondence. Al-Hire. This was not accidental. Al-Hire became visible precisely because it was central. When multiple unrelated cases pointed to the same detention site, the abstraction broke. Observers could no longer dismiss concerns as isolated incidents. Diplomatic cables later cited by investigative journalists revealed that some foreign governments quietly sought information about nationals believed to be held at Al-Hire. These discussions were rarely public. When they were, the language was cautious, monitoring, seeking clarification, raising concerns. No government publicly accused Saudi Arabia of operating illegal detention sites. Instead, they asked about access, due process, and timelines. The Saudi government's responses followed a consistent pattern. Officials emphasized sovereignty. They cited domestic law. They reiterated that all detainees were held under legal authority and subject to judicial oversight. They rejected characterizations of Al-Hire as a secret prison, noting that it is referenced in court documents and official proceedings. From a legal standpoint, this matters. Secrecy in this case does not mean non-existence. It means limited visibility. And that distinction became the battleground. International media outlets attempted to fill the gaps. Long-form investigations mapped references to Al-Hire across dozens of cases. Reporters interviewed former detainees, lawyers, and family members. Patterns emerged even when details remained sparse. One investigation published by a major Western newspaper analyzed court rulings over a 5-year period. Al-Hire appeared repeatedly as the site of pretrial detention in security cases. The article did not allege illegality. It questioned proportionality. How long is too long? How much secrecy is necessary? These questions do not have simple answers, especially in national security contexts. But once asked publicly, they cannot be unheard. Saudi state media responded by framing Al-Hire as a necessary institution in a region facing genuine security threats. Commentators pointed to attacks that had been prevented, cells dismantled, lives saved. They argued that critics focused on procedure while ignoring outcomes. This created two parallel narratives. In one, Al-Hire is a shield. In the other, it is a shadow. The clash between these narratives intensified when specific detainee cases became international causes. In several documented instances, Foreign leaders mentioned detained individuals during press conferences or parliamentary sessions. Names were spoken aloud. Locations implied. Pressure mounted. According to diplomatic reporting, these moments triggered internal reviews. Transfers occurred. Some detainees were moved to other facilities. Some cases progressed more quickly through the courts. The government did not publicly link these outcomes to external pressure, but the timing did not go unnoticed. This is how influence works in closed systems, not through direct confrontation but through sustained attention. Yet attention cuts both ways. Saudi officials warned that politicizing security cases could undermine counterterrorism efforts. They argued that public campaigns oversimplified complex investigations and risked encouraging extremism. The result was stalemate. Al-Hayr remained operational. Its role did not change publicly, but its name now carried weight beyond Saudi borders. For detainees inside, according to later interviews, this external focus was barely perceptible. Daily routines continued unchanged. Information about international debates rarely filtered through. The prison remained inward-facing. But decisions made outside its walls began to shape what happened inside. Legal scholars analyzing Saudi court trends noted subtle shifts. Some cases saw more detailed written judgments. Some sentences referenced procedural safeguards more explicitly. These changes cannot be definitively attributed to international scrutiny, but they coincided with it. Transparency did not arrive all at once. It crept in through footnotes. At the same time, critics argued that cosmetic changes did not address core concerns. They pointed to continued reports of prolonged detention and limited access to counsel. Saudi authorities rejected these claims, stating that reforms were ongoing and that reports often relied on outdated or biased sources. Both sides cited facts. Both sides disputed interpretation. And in the middle sat Al-Hayr, unchanged in structure, but transformed in meaning. It was no longer just a detention center. It was a reference point in global debates about security, sovereignty, and human rights. For the families of detainees, this shift was bittersweet. Increased attention sometimes led to answers. Sometimes it led to silence hardening into policy. Speaking out could help or harm. One family member, quoted anonymously in a verified report, described the fear of becoming the next example. The statement reflects perception, not confirmed policy, but perception drives behavior. This is the invisible reach of institutions like Al-Hayr. They do not need to act to influence. Their existence is enough. As international pressure ebbed and flowed, one thing became clear: Al-Hayr was not going away. It was embedded in Saudi Arabia's security architecture. Any meaningful change would be incremental, internal, and carefully managed. Which raises the final, uncomfortable question. If a prison operates within the law, but beyond public understanding, who decides when scrutiny becomes interference? There is no court ruling that answers that. We will turn inward again, examining the psychological toll of indefinite security detention, what former detainees say about life after Al-Hayr, and how the prison's impact extends far beyond its walls. Because the end of detention does not always mean the end of confinement. Release does not arrive with celebration. According to verified interviews and court outcomes, when detainees leave Al-Hayr prison, it is often quiet, administrative, almost abrupt. A notice, a signature, a return of clothing that no longer feels familiar. And then the outside world, unchanged, impatient, and already moving on. For many former detainees, freedom begins with rules. Publicly documented cases show that release conditions can include travel restrictions, reporting requirements, or limitations on communication. The Saudi government has not published a comprehensive list of post-release measures, but courts have referenced them in sentencing and release orders. Officials describe these conditions as preventative, designed to reduce security risks after detention. Former detainees describe them differently. In verified interviews with international media, several released individuals said the conditions felt like detention by another name. They could go home. They could see family. But they could not leave the country. Some could not speak publicly. Others were advised, informally they said, to avoid certain people, certain places, certain topics. None of these accounts allege illegality. They describe impact. One former detainee, identified here under a composite name as Yusuf, told a Western journalist that the most difficult part was not what happened inside Al-Hayr, but what followed. He said friends stopped calling. Employers stopped responding. Neighbors became cautious. His detention, though never resulting in a conviction, had redefined him. His account cannot be independently verified in full, but it mirrors others. Legal scholars note that in security-related cases, stigma can persist regardless of outcome. This is not unique to Saudi Arabia. It is a global phenomenon. But at Al Hayar, the effect appears magnified by secrecy. People know the name. They do not know the details. And when details are missing, imagination fills the gap. Psychologists who study post-detention reintegration emphasize that uncertainty is a critical factor. Former detainees often struggle with anxiety, hypervigilance, and a sense of suspended identity. These observations are general and not specific to Al Hayar, but they align with what former detainees describe. Several individuals interviewed after release said they had trouble sleeping for months. Others avoided public places. Some described fear without a clear source. Fear of being watched, fear of being misunderstood, fear of returning. The Saudi government has not publicly addressed psychological aftereffects of detention, though officials have referenced rehabilitation programs and other facilities aimed at reintegration and de-radicalization. Whether such programs apply to all Al Hayar detainees is unclear. What is clear is this: release does not erase the past. Court records show that some former detainees later reappeared in legal proceedings, either for alleged violations of release conditions or new charges. Authorities cite these cases as evidence that strict monitoring is necessary. Critics argue they demonstrate a cycle that is difficult to escape. Both interpretations exist simultaneously. For families, the return is often complicated. Relief mixes with caution. In verified interviews, relatives described learning not to ask questions, not to dwell on details, not to attract attention. Silence becomes a survival strategy. One family member, quoted anonymously by a regional outlet, said that when her brother came home, they avoided even using the word prison. It was as if naming it might invite it back. This is the long shadow of Al Hayar. It does not end at the gate. It stretches into homes, workplaces, conversations left unfinished. And yet, not all stories are the same. Some former detainees have managed to rebuild. Court records show individuals who completed sentences, complied with conditions, and gradually resumed public life. Their paths are quieter, less reported, less dramatic. But they exist. These cases complicate the narrative. They show that Al Hayar is not a permanent endpoint for everyone. Outcomes vary. Context matters. What unites these stories is not suffering alone. It is uncertainty. Inside the prison, detainees often do not know when their cases will move forward. Outside, they often do not know when their past will stop defining them. This uncertainty is not codified in law. It is not written in verdicts. But it shapes lives as surely as any sentence. International observers who track detention outcomes note that the lack of public information makes it difficult to assess long-term impact. Data is limited. Access is restricted. Conclusions are tentative. And so Al Hayar remains what it has always been: a place that resists clarity. Not because nothing happens there, but because what happens there rarely resolves cleanly. In the final chapter, we will step back one last time. We will examine what Al Hayar represents in the broader landscape of modern security detention, and why its story matters far beyond Saudi Arabia. Because in a world increasingly defined by fear and control, the question is no longer whether places like this exist. It's whether we understand the power they hold. Every system has a boundary. Not a wall or a fence, but a line where certainty ends and discretion begins. Al Hayar prison sits precisely on that line, between law and secrecy, between protection and control, between what is documented and what is merely inferred. From the outside, Al Hayar is often described as a place of silence. But silence does not mean emptiness. It means containment. According to court records, government statements, and years of investigative reporting, Al Hayar functions exactly as Saudi Arabia's security architecture intends it to function. It is not hidden from the legal system. It is embedded within it. Judges reference it. Prosecutors rely on it. Laws make space for it. And yet, despite that legality, its impact extends far beyond the courtroom. Al Hayar reveals something fundamental about how modern states manage perceived threats. Not just through punishment, but through uncertainty. Not just through verdicts, but through time itself. Detention that stretches, processes that slow, answers that arrive late or not at all. This is not unique to Saudi Arabia. Around the world, high-security detention centers operate under similar logic. Different laws. Different names. The same core question: how much opacity is justified in the name of security? Al Hayar matters because it forces that question into focus. Supporters of the system argue that the stakes are real. Extremism is real. Violence is real. They point to attacks prevented, networks disrupted, lives saved. They argue that critics speak from a distance, insulated from the consequences of failure. Critics respond that unchecked secrecy carries its own risks. That prolonged detention without visibility erodes trust. That fear, once institutionalized, does not remain neatly contained. Both sides are arguing from evidence. Both are arguing from experience. And Al-Hire stands between them unchanged. For the detainees who pass through its gates, the prison is not an abstract debate. It is fluorescent light at fixed hours. It is routines without timelines. It is the slow recalibration of identity, first as a suspect, then as a case number, then, sometimes, as a former detainee carrying a name that follows you long after release. For families, it is waiting without information, learning restraint, measuring words, discovering that silence can be inherited. For the state, it is a tool, one it believes is necessary, one it continues to defend. What makes Al-Hire exceptional is not cruelty proven in court, nor illegality established by verdict. It is the accumulation of unanswered questions, and the fact that those questions persist year after year. How long should investigation last? How much should the public know? When does protection become preemption? There are no definitive answers in the records. Only outcomes. Some detainees are convicted. Some are released. Some disappear back into private life. Some remain inside. The system moves on. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Al-Hire does not need to shock to endure. It does not rely on spectacle. Its power lies in procedure, in classification, in the quiet authority of files stamped and doors closed. It is a prison that does not announce itself, yet shapes lives across borders. This story does not end with resolution, because Al-Hire does not offer one. It exists in an ongoing present, adapting quietly, absorbing attention, outlasting outrage. And as long as security remains the highest priority, places like this will remain difficult to fully see, by design. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. What remains unchanged is the question Al-Hire leaves behind. When a prison becomes a symbol, who controls its meaning? The state that built it, or the world trying to understand it? The gates are still closed. The files are still active. And the silence for now holds